want to thank everyone who has signed up for this AS2 presentation. This is Alan Page on the abuse and misuse of test automation. And for those who aren't familiar, I think everyone hopefully is aware of who Alan Page is. But if you aren't, he's one of two co-hosts on one of my favorite podcasts called A/B Testing. They rant and talk a lot about testing, but one of the more common themes of the podcast is what modern testing is. And I think you should check them out. Just go ahead and Google A/B Testing. It's a really fantastic podcast. Alan's also done a number of conference talks, keynotes all across the world. He usually does at least 2 or 3 per year, so keep an eye out for that. He's also written 2 testing books. The first one, How We Test Software at Microsoft. It's pretty well known, I think, in the testing community. He's also got another book, which I really liked. It's called The A Word. It's available on LeanPub. I think you should check that one out. It's really relevant. And I think some of the things that he's going to talk about here are from the A Word. So they sort of go hand in hand, supplemental text. And so that's what I have to say. So I'm just going to go and throw it over to Alan and take it away, Alan.
I'm here. Thank you for the introduction. One addendum to your introduction, I would say if you're searching for the podcast, if you just search for A/B testing, you're going to get the topics on experimentation around A/B testing. You should probably search on A/B testing podcast, and then you'll find it. And also you can, when the slide link goes out to you, there will be a link at the end of the deck in my shameless self-promotion slide. So, but yeah, thank you very much for the plug. How We Test Software at Microsoft was a nice documentation of a time in history that has become more obsolete as the years have gone by. So A Word I recommend, still relevant. You can read the other book if you're interested in a snapshot in time of Microsoft's history. And that's it for my comments on the intro. But thank you again for having me. One thing I do like to talk about is my opinions. And occasionally and frequently my opinions have something to do with software testing and topics that all of you listening are interested in. So let's sit back and we'll talk about the abuse and misuse of test automation. So, wrong window. First of all, what is testing and why do we test? And this is, I'll ask rhetorically, of course, but testing has lots of definitions and you can pick the one that suits you best and kind of picture one in your head. And then you can think about why we test. And a definition from Michael Bolton that will work here is, works with my beliefs. He says testing is a process of experience, discovery, and learning. And I'm paraphrasing, so if that's incorrect, I'm sure he will let me know. But the way I put that more simply is I'm a big fan of this guy, Philip Armour, who has these levels of ignorance, which is a model to discover how we learn things. And we take things that we don't know, and they become something we know we don't know. And from there, we can choose to make them something that we do know. And that's how we acquire knowledge. So when I think about what test is testing is an activity to acquire knowledge. And in our case, we want to learn more about the software under test. So I think I don't think I'm going to cause a lot of controversy with that statement. What I do, not intentionally, but what I end up with when I give presentations is I get a few head nods. Yeah, I get this. And I'll also probably get, although virtually, because I can't see you, a few looks of horror from the people listening to my talks. And that's how I know I'm in the sweet spot of attempting to, I won't say innovate, but attempting to advance testing. So I think we can agree on this part. Testing is a way for us to learn more about the software, and we can use that information to make decisions about product quality, to either pass that information to others or use the information to convince others of the status of the product. And of course, we're going to use automation for that. But one thing, and my first gripe maybe I'll get to today, one of many, is that automation is a means to an end, not the goal. I see a lot of people focus on the test automation, writing a bunch of tests to do stuff, versus the goal of learning more about the software so we can make the right product decisions for our organization. And I can probably visualize a few head nods from you right now, because that's, I think, fairly common today. So let me talk about a few things I see. One view of test automation is that the robots are taking over. I see fear, I hear fear from, or emotions at least close to fear, from many testers who are worried that automation will take away their job. I see fear that test management, or management in general, wants to replace testers' job with automation. And interestingly, you see this parallel throughout other industries as well. A few years ago, I was listening to the radio. I realized, as I say that, I haven't listened to a radio in so long. I don't know how those businesses stay in business. I'm an avid podcast listener on my morning commute, or occasionally I'll stream things from Spotify in my car. Back on topic here, listening to radio, and they were talking about how Amazon, which are a local company here in the Seattle area where I'm from, we're going to begin using robots a lot more to pick items off the shelf for packaging and shipping. And I thought first, that's what a great idea. And there were, interestingly, a lot of phone calls to the station of people mad that robots were taking away people's jobs. And a lot of people were on that side, and some people said, well, no, it frees up. There's still a lot of knowledge work to be done at Amazon, and the robots, they're replacing some menial labor, but it's enabling more people to do more brain engaged work. And as I was listening to it, as I'm sure as I set it up within the context of this talk, you all realize that the parallels between that conversation and some of the fear of test automation are notable. And it was interesting for me to listen to that, and I thought a lot about that in the years since then. So there are a lot of people thinking the robots are taking over, but as someone who's been doing testing and involved in test automation for going on 25 years or so, it's so many years I don't count it as much, I can tell you from my perspective, the robots are not taking over. And again, head nods from this crowd as well, because while some of you may be test automators, or most of you, some of you may not be. And this idea that test automation could take over all testing is incorrect for most software, and nearly all software. And I won't go into too many of the details on when or why that may be true or not, but the robots aren't taking over. And let me talk a little about why. And here's where, now that the head nods are over, some strong opinions about automation follow. Here is an example. This is the Mike Cohn testing pyramid, which is based on automated testing pyramid, which is based on other test pyramids. Before, and now I'm getting the first shakes of their head, like, what does this mean? George Box quote, which I'm sure all testers know, always comes to mind: all models are wrong, some are useful. Here is a model that is wrong, or could be seen as wrong, but I find very useful. What Mike Cohn said about this automation pyramid is that the bulk of our tests should be unit tests. And then we have some service or integration or acceptance level tests that work. We should write a fair number of those. And this pyramid is not to scale, because if you read the article that Mike Cohn wrote about the testing automation pyramid, he said for the UI level or the end-to-end level, whatever you want to call it, you should write as few tests as possible. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but that's the way. Lots of unit tests, a good number of integration tests or service level tests, and then as few UI tests as possible. And what teams end up doing, what I've seen a lot of, is more of the test automation ice cream cone, where they have a small number of unit tests, some more integration tests, a whole bunch of automated GUI tests, and then maybe some manual tests sprinkled on top. I think, and I hope most of you agree with me, I think the ice cream model is horribly inefficient and a great example of an anti-pattern, something we don't want to do. So what worries me more is when I see comments like this. It's just today's list of Quora, looking at software test automation or testing links, is I see a lot of this. How do I get to be a test automator? I see, I didn't find this exact quote, but what I see a lot of times in forums and on Quora and at LinkedIn is, I'm a manual tester. How do I get into automation? How do I switch from manual to automation? Is it something good for me to get into? And my big peeve here, as I maybe roll up one slide again, if I can, is I mentioned you should write as few UI automation tests as possible. Actually, I mentioned that Mike Cohn said that. And then what I see in reality is we get teams to write a whole bunch of automated GUI tests. These testers, if you read that are posting these things on Quora, if you read what they are writing in the text, or if you're involved in the internet on Twitter, on LinkedIn, wherever you go to find your information, and you see posts like these, they want to, air quote, get into GUI automation. And it's for me, I'll set it right out here, it's the wrong thing to do. I have written, in my role as a tester, I have been very much what I call a specializing generalist. Someone who can do a lot of things and some things very well. Some of the things I'm very good at is testing, and that's both exploratory testing, making sure all aspects of quality are covered, looking at agile test quadrants, finding ways to accelerate the team. I also, over the years, have learned how to program. I've found that learning how to program has made me a much better tester. I've written some test automation. I've written probably quite a bit of test automation. Also a lot of tools, diagnostic tools, as well as product code. I have, if you have an Xbox One, I wrote a small chunk of, well, rewrote and fixed a small chunk of the Blu-ray decoder. I have shipped code in Windows, CE. I've shipped production code all across Microsoft. Is, I guess, the short point I wanted to make. I've also written a fair amount of test automation. I don't know if it's a lot or a little. It's just been doing it for a long time. What I've discovered is writing good, reliable UI automation that is not flaky, actually exercises the product in a way that is useful, and the results are useful, and the number of false positives is low or non-existent. Running that really high quality UI automation, even if it's through a tool like Selenium, where it's a small layer below the direct UI, direct button pushing, is one of the most difficult programming tasks you can take on. And I'll repeat that again, because I believe this is true, that writing good, and I'll say it shorter this time, writing good UI automation is one of the most difficult programming tasks you can do. And I fully believe that to be true. I don't believe that has changed in years and years. Yet, we take brand new, air quote, manual testers, brand new people to programming, and we assign them the task of writing UI automation. So let's take the people who know the least about programming, have the least experience in patterns and anti-patterns, and let's give them the most difficult task they can do to start off on. And what happens there is either they fail, one, because they just don't know how to do it, two, because they create a bunch of crummy tests and the team spends more of their time, and I've been on teams like this, who have spent more time debugging failures every day than actually doing important testing. Those things drive me crazy. If you look at what's coming out of that, again, going back to the ice cream cone, went too far. We have all these automated GUI tests, and they're gross. They're awful. They're not designed well. I've watched testers lose their testing mindset. They get so caught up in the fact of I want to make the UI do this and do this and do this versus actually learning something about the product is they create a mess. I could probably come up with something besides an ice cream cone, but that would be inappropriate to show my disdain for that approach. So rant number one, I guess, is the industry infatuation with automating end-to-end tests is not helping software quality. One thing, a variation, I guess, is the software testing cupcake, where you have a few more tests. But I like to show it because it's this may, if you didn't like the ice cream cone because you know we have a good number of unit tests. We just think we need a lot of automated GUI tests and a whole crap load of manual tests. You can also opt to use the cupcake. One way I do like using this model that I promise I will leave the pyramid behind for a while is, this is from Noah Sussman, is treating the pyramid as a bandpass filter. If you look at the top of every single bug that can occur, the unit test should find every single bug that can occur at the unit level. Integration or systems test should find every bug that could only be caught at that level. And end-to-end tests, if you get the pattern, should only find bugs that can only be found when you put the large number of components together. So when we're writing end-to-end or UI tests, the only tests we should write are for things that we think can only happen at that level. And then there's some things, there's subtle things, as we know, this is why the robots are not taking over. Even in the parts of the product that I own at Unity, even pieces that are almost entirely a back-end service, there are things that just need they can't be tested entirely automatically. They need some human judgment. And that could be judgment on a UI if there's no UI. It could be looking at how it's behaving and monitoring. Artificial intelligence has, while getting better, has not got to the state where we can automate away human judgment. So then the way you can look at this bandpass filter is when we find bugs, and often what we do in testing is we find the bug, we go add a regression test for it. That regression test should be added at the lowest level where we can catch it. And instead of what I see often is, oh, we found a bug, let's go add a new UI test to catch that bug. If we can add a unit test that would catch that bug from happening in the future, that's where we should add it. So looking at the pyramid this way, I find very valuable. It is a nice way to, I think it's a very nice way to look at the types of testing we do. All right, as I mentioned, I'm done with the pyramid for now. We'll move on. So let's talk about test design. And I was surprised. So I gave a version of this talk at a conference a few months ago, and someone had said they had never thought of test design as an activity. And what test design, and it made me think about it, well, why not? And maybe it's thought of subconsciously. For me, test design is how we come up with our test ideas. Is what do we use for those? Things like whether it's heuristics or just look at boundaries, or look at, I want to try, you've all seen the t-shirt, says a tester goes into a bar, orders a beer, orders -1 beers, orders A beers. We test design is thinking about what are all those ideas. And again, no need for virtual hands, rhetorical questions. I assume everyone here is a tester in some capacity. Some of you are automators, or you write test automation. And probably all of you, I hope, if you answered yes to question number 1, are test designers. I'm appreciative of the manual testing rule, and I think and I also agree that maybe manual isn't the best word for that, but it's you get what I mean. Test design is something we all need to do. We all have to have skills in thinking about and continually grow our skills and thinking about what needs to be tested. And I don't have rant number 2 coming up here, 2 of many, is I don't like scripted manual cases. Do A, then B, then C. I at all. I think there are ways around that can even handle if there's a bean counter you have to deal with that wants to count test cases or something dumb like that. You can ping me afterwards. My Twitter handle is on a couple of these slides, and I'll give you contact information at the end. I can help you deal with that. I think that, please, I hope none of you are stuck in a job where you have to do manual scripted cases all day or even most of the day or frankly part of the day. But what's worse is I see some companies, they have manual testers or test analysts, whatever you want to call them. They create the test cases and then pass them off to test automation to go automate them. I think it's an absolutely horrible way to create automation and pretty much a horrible way to test. There's no distinction between test design and automated test design. Some are, I guess I can just leave it at that. There's just no distinction to me. And there shouldn't be to any of you as well. We think about how are we going to test the product? Some of those ways will require some exploratory testing, depending on the product, some percentage, and some, like, we really need to write tests or tools to help us with this. There's some sorts of tests that are just going to be more prone to test automation. For example, let's say I'm testing a messaging app and I want to see how many users can be added to a conversation. I could one by one add them, or I could write a quick little bit of automation that added users, or maybe even created accounts and added users one by one until failure or until I reached some limit near or at the spec, if there was one. But my automation heuristic is easy, or one of them. It's, would I be bored doing this test manually? And if it is, I automate it. I've been writing automation before I knew I was writing automation. Everything from batch files, from shell scripts to VB script to compiled code, writing tools to help me test is a form of test automation. Some would say it is test automation, and I think it's just getting the vocabulary right. You may, if you've those of you that have followed me before may have heard this from me. Here is my tip on, this is my answer to the question of how many tests should I automate, or which test should I automate? And my answer that I will never change, because I've been giving this for probably close to 10 years, is that you should automate 100% of the tests that should be automated. The test design challenge is, of course, figuring out which tests should be automated. And that's where test design comes in, and that's where we actually apply value from our testing knowledge. So let me brainstorm my way through a test design question. So here is the Google sign-up account, Google sign-up sheet, and I'm going to think quickly, out loud, a little bit how I'd test this. Obviously, I would spend more than 2 minutes on this if this was my job, but for the sake of example, we'll go through it. So name and first name, of course, I want to look at everything we talked about with the tester order to beer example. Is how long can my first name be? What characters can be in it? I may very well have accents in my name. Usernames, I'm not going to go too crazy. Well, actually, I will, because I'm thinking out loud here. I know there is an RFC for email names, so I can go look that up and see which characters are accurate. I want to make sure all variations of those work. I also know that some characters are invalid for email addresses on the internet. I want to make sure those are rejected appropriately. Password, oh my God, I could think of all kinds of things for password rules. Luckily, Google knows what they're doing and don't put any sort of strange restrictions on your password rules. And I say that on the secure side. I gripe at my bank a lot because they have so many rules around what the password can be as length and characters that I believe they reduce the sample set of, I don't believe, they do reduce the sample set of possible characters and therefore make passwords, 1, less easy to remember, and 2, less secure. So all sorts of password rules. I will try spaces, punctuation, all the different combinations. And if they have rules like I can't have consecutive letters, I'm going to test around that. Maybe try consecutive lowercase, uppercase. Confirmation, I want to make sure it works both with a confirmed password, not a password. I may try things like non-breaking spaces in one and a regular space in the other to see if those are caught as same or different. And then for birthday, we all know the feeble attempts of calendars in the world. So I'm going to try and exploit all of those birthdays in the future, birthdays that may be too young. Maybe my birthday's tomorrow. I will try and pick days that don't exist. February 29th in a non-leap year. Probably jump through a bunch of things like that. Now, that's probably a pretty typical test design process. And a lot of that can be done exploratory. But now think of this. I may have a list of, think of all those different characters I wanted to try. And, oh, I didn't put it in, I don't think I put it in this presentation, but Chris, our host here, has posted a link to the big list of naughty strings that I'm sure he'll post somewhere, put somewhere we can look at, which is a great way to get test ideas for string input. But I am probably going to build a data-driven test for this. I'm going to make a list of first names and last names that cover all the different things we talked about and use that to drive the testing of this. Because I don't want to, it's, again, I get a little bored thinking about going through all of those different ideas. Now, I dumped all those on you, but I probably forgot everything I said, and you may have forgotten everything I said. So the way I approach test design in general, and I've used these as my test design documents for several teams, including my last few teams at Microsoft. Instead of the traditional, I don't know if I'm air quoting that again because I don't know if there's a traditional test design doc or how you describe your testing or if you need to, but I use mind maps. And I think this crowd probably does a lot too. But I use a mind map to document how I'm going to approach testing. And then I may go and color code this or circle things like I want to automate this one, or I want to talk about this one, or I can use this to communicate. And I've given this to developers I've been working with, thinking, here's how I think I'm going to test this. And it worked great as a communication method because people will add to it. They go, oh, what about this? Oh, that can't happen. Well, how can it happen? We'll walk through and we can have a great discussion about a single piece of paper with a whole bunch of bubbles on it. So this is what I use for test design. It's how it's kind of my way of approaching test design. And I'll, like I said, circle things that are automated, et cetera, et cetera. Let's do another example. I wrote an application, which Chris will jump in and tell me if it doesn't show up. There it is. Hopefully you can see that. This is an application we're going to test together where I visualize your thoughts. All you do is you press the roll button and it generates 5 random numbers. I'm giving you the spec as we go. In fact, over there's the spec in my test cases. All it does is generates 5 random numbers between 0 and 9, and it sums them up. 11, 18, 24, 33. It looks good. 7. Okay. Those look random. Do a few more. 11, 17. Yeah. Let's ship it. I hope you're shaking your head now because I don't want to ship this. Maybe I'll actually one more time. 7, 11. Okay, actually now I can ship it. That one was a 0 last time too. Okay, it does change. 12, 17. Okay, now we can ship it. I hope you're still shaking your head. And imagine this is, maybe it's a Las Vegas gambling app or something. But we want to make sure this works correctly. It's a little contrived, so forgive me. But it's very easy. Like there's not a lot of exploration needed here. I could try and close this, I guess, make sure it closes. There isn't really a lot to do here. But how do I know it does what it says it does? And again, the spec is, you press this button, it's going to generate 5 random numbers and add them together. So as I mind map this, I don't need to draw my map for this because there's not much to it, but I need to make sure that this number is correct. So I want to add these. And then I also want to make sure that it's random. And testing random is a great testing challenge because randomness is all about predictability. Do any of these numbers have a higher chance of showing up? And random also requires uh, more numbers. I want to look at this a bunch of times and see if there are any uh, anomalies. So let's, again, Chris will jump me up. Luckily, I have a test app. That's not the one. All this guy does, takes a parameter, how many times to roll, and you can see the numbers rolling. That's great, exciting. The one great thing people seem to like the most about test automation is just watching the UI go crazy. I actually wrote some UI automation for some web UI automation this week, and that was my favorite part too. That's the wrong log file. Sorry. Numbers test.log. That's the wrong log file. Give me a moment to figure out where my log file went. That is strange. Okay, maybe I won't show you my log file because I don't know where it went. There, never mind. I just don't know how to title my files. Okay, here's the output. Well, look at that. A couple things, and I'm gonna make this a little bit bigger. Is in writing an automated, now you watched me click that roll button a bunch of times and there were no mistakes. But here, when I ran it, this is weird. On loop iteration 77 out of 100 times, saw me run that, the total was off by 1. Okay, that's one thing I want to look at some more. And then 3 showed up a little bit more often, but out of 100 times, maybe that's okay. I don't know. Let's do it again. Testing for random, we should probably do 1,000 times at a minimum. I could do more, but I don't want you to watch this app run forever. We can do 1,000 and probably the time it takes me to finish this sentence, or a little longer. Let's see if we learn more about this. Seriously, I said 1,000, right? There we go. It's done. Okay, we still had an addition error. Off by 1 again. Interesting. 3 is still a little bit higher. That could be an anomaly. If you know anything about testing random numbers or looking for randomness, the more you generate, the more numbers you generate, the more accurate it is. So this anomaly is beginning to look a little bit more like a bad thing. So let me talk about why I'm automating this contrived example while we run this maybe 5,000 times. So this example is contrived. So there are actually bugs in the code causing these errors that we're seeing in the log file to occur. Specific, not even bugs in the code. It's just I've written the code to generate the error at very small percentages of time. But what this does is, to me, it simulates, and not to me, but my goal is this simulates real world test scenarios we see. Sometimes, and I've been on products where, yes, this error only occurs if the person is using this version of Firefox and they're in the East Coast data center and they're on Mac High Sierra. Those sorts of bugs happen. And looking at the power of data and looking at this, whether I test running this or looking at data I collect through product instrumentation, sometimes these bugs only occur in those in very rare scenarios. So being able to run tests, being able to add to a messaging app, add 1,000 users, generate a large number of user profiles, things like that. So in fact, I think the better way to put this is the loop is undervalued in test automation. And as I mentioned before, we see a lot of people focus on test automation, doing that end to end. I want the UI to do this and this and this and this and this. And sometimes those tests don't even do any verification to make sure those things happen. They just exercise the product. Record and playback automation is infamous for that. Just exercising the software. I think the power of the loop to do things. Like I just wrote this UI automation I wrote last week. Was for archive flow for Unity projects online, and I created some random project names, and then I thought, well, I'm here. Why don't I write a separate test that sees how I don't know how many projects I can create before the system craps out on me. So that test, leveraging the power of the loop, super easy to do, and I have that data. Let's look at the output log when we do 5,000 entries. Oh boy, I had a lot more loop iteration errors running 5,000 times, and every time it's under by 1, which is weird. And again, it's contrived. The code actually does that. I will give you a link to the code. But the other thing I see also is, yeah, the number 3 is favored. And it isn't until you start running this 1,000, 5,000 times that you begin to see things like this. So this is the sort of thing that I would write automation for. I want to write automation for, one example is writing automation for things that I can't, I need to loop on. I can't, I don't feel like I can test thoroughly manually. I don't feel I can give it the testing attention it needs. I don't feel like I can learn enough about the product by just exercising it manually. So that's the purpose of that contrived example. I hope it gets the point across, but you're welcome to play with this yourself. I have known people that have used, for better or for worse, used numbers as a interview question. I wouldn't evaluate a tester entirely on their ability to test this, but the idea to come up with the ideas for something so simple can be interesting. One of my gripes, by the way, around testing challenges we give people, and I've seen this happen in all communities, I won't pick anyone out, is the examples we give are so bug prone that it's just shooting fish in a barrel. I would prefer, if you're coming up with testing challenges for whether it's for interviews or for practice or testing kata, is that we make the software fairly bug free so it's difficult to find any bugs. I think the good testers I know thrive in those sorts of environments. Maybe you want a more buggy app for a brand new tester, but I think for learning testing and really engaging the brain, let's give each other test examples that are really difficult to find bugs in. We talked through this. I'm sorry if I just used it all example wise. Here's my test code. It is some of the worst test code I've ever written. This is C++, and I say worst because it's brute force. Don't worry about what all these things mean, and don't freak out because I have code in my slide, but I am physically just pressing the button down and releasing the mouse button, and then using the power of the loop to go through and get the total, just scraping the text straight off the screen for both for the numbers and for the totals. It's brute force, but in this case, it's the right automation. I'm not happy with it, but it's great. If you want to play with it yourself, you're welcome to. There's a link for the GitHub link for all this as you've seen it today. I did a pull and build this morning, so what you saw is exactly what's up there. Feel free to, if you want me to add different bugs or do things, feel free to add those to the issues list up there, or make a branch yourself and play with it as you want. Do whatever you want with it. So that's my numbers example. Let me talk about another rant before we get into questions. This is the whole damn pass, fail, red, green thing. In test automation, we run a bunch of tests, some pass, some fail, and again, virtual head nods or shaking of your heads. How often are those failures actually not a bug? And if the answer is more than 0%, it's bad. It's bad. I had teams at Microsoft that would run, they're so proud because they ran 1 million tests and they'd have like a 99% pass rate, but that still leaves a large number of failures to go investigate. And that led to tools to auto analyze or to figure out if these bugs were the same bug, which is actually good. But one practice, I'll call it an anti-pattern I've seen, is you'll run a test, it'll fail, so you'll run it again, and it passes, so you say, okay, great, no bug. And if my camera was on, you could see me face palm right now, because I think that's awful, just horrible, because those intermittent bugs, and what we do in test automation too often is we say, oh, it's okay, it's probably just a test failure. And those intermittent bugs are the bugs that drive our customers crazy. It's the ones that make them think our software is buggy. Those intermittent bugs we have to care about. And we're so enamored with trying to make our pass rate higher or trying to have fewer tests that we have to go investigate that will jump through hoops. I've seen teams go one farther and they'll keep rerunning the test and they won't count it as a failure unless the test fails 10 times in a row. And otherwise it's a pass. And just, as much as I hope you're not doing it, I bet at least one person listening is doing that. And it just kills me. I think as an industry, as a test software role, profession, whatever you want to call us, we have too much tolerance for unreliable tests. I went to the Google Test Automation Conference, I think it's been 3 years ago now, and every single talk talked about flaky tests. I joked about renaming the conference the Flaky Test Conference. Just ridiculous, but it's just like something we do. And here's where we work around our flaky tests. Let's write tests that aren't flaky. And where you can't, there's some, we'll talk about that in a minute, but I think in 99% of the cases, totally made up number, we can just write better tests. And we need to do that by writing more of the tests that can be reliable, which is writing fewer of those UI end-to-end tests. I mentioned we fail the test and we run it and it passed. Yay! Boo! The oracle, the part of the test that determines whether it passed or failed, that's the difficult part. I went through a exercise many years ago. I was testing the graphic device interface on Windows 98, and we had a big philosophical discussion on whether we could use a function called getPixel, which gets the coordinates of a pixel on the screen, to test setPixel, the function that gets the color of a pixel coordinate. And I could have. Maybe I'll just write something that goes directly to the video driver's memory and pulls it out of memory so I get the right thing, which it turns out that's what getPixel kind of does anyway. And at some point you have to realize, yes, I can use getPixel to test setPixel, and I can write a great automated test that tries different on-screen, off-screen coordinates. But really, if the pixels look wrong, people are going to know right away. But that oracle can really lead you down a rat hole. Lots of test code smells. We all know about them. I'm not going to go through them all, but we sleep versus using proper wait states. I'm not going to bash Selenium. I like Selenium, but it's littered with different wait statements. Sometimes people give up because they can't find the right wait statement, so they're just out of sleep. And it's inefficient. You never know if it's the right length. People either get failures because their sleep wasn't long enough, or their code runs inefficiently. There are a bunch of other things using a lot of extra. Another easy one is a lot of logic in the test code. Test code should be fairly low complexity. It should just do the thing, verify the thing, move on. And then with failures, one thing I found valuable to measure is mean time to diagnose. When there is a failure, how long does it take for you to figure out what was the cause of the failure? And if you have to run the test out of the debugger, you've lost. Add logging. Errors like this are exciting, but unhelpful. Product logs are massively important, or your test logs. I believe that 100% of your tests should be debuggable by the logs it creates, or by the system, or by the logs of system under test, or the combination of the two. If not, if you find a test where you have to go load it under the debugger, I would do it. I would add the logging as part of that fix. That will help make your tests less flaky. So I have many, many more rants, and the A word is a good collection of those. The A word in this case is automation on LeanPub, but I think automated testing, of course, augments human testing. It helps you become a better tester. If you're writing tests to replace testers' work, you're probably not thinking about test at the right holistic level. Please focus on testing, learning more about the product, and not just automating. That trap is fallen into far too much. And the other important takeaway, it goes way back to one of the first slides, is you can't think about automated testing as a separate activity from human testing. If those are in different orgs, I'm telling you it's wrong, and you can contact me on how to fix that problem. I'm good at organizational change as well. But even as you approach your own testing, if you're responsible for all of it, say you're the embedded tester on an Agile team, you should think about what is all the testing that needs to get done, and what are the pieces that it would make sense for us as a team to automate, and what are the pieces that I'm going to use my test specialist skills to go explore by myself. And that, in a nutshell, is my views on the use and abuse of test automation. So I'm going to leave up the vanity slide here while Chris collates a few questions for me, if I can fit those in the last 11 minutes.
Yeah, great. That's a great slide too. Yeah, so we do have a number of questions, and actually several of them are around the test automation pyramid, or the cone, and or the whatever else it.
Yes, whatever flavor of model you want to use. Yes.
That's right. And so someone said, so the original slide that you showed was Mike Cohen's, and then the cone. And so with reference to Mike Cohen's pyramid, the question was basically, where do you see manual testing in that chart? What would you think it would look like in terms of the size of the pyramid? So Mike Cohen's is just about test automation,
right.
whereas
he's just about test automation. So it's there indirectly in Noah's upside down pyramid. There is a level below automated tests, or the tip of the pyramid, where there are tests that can only be caught by a human. There are bugs that can only be caught by a human. So if I were to draw, again, all models are wrong, some are useful. I would fit manual testing in right at the very top of the pyramid. I think so it's needed, and depending on the product, and like a game, for example, an Xbox AAA game is going to need a lot bigger chunk of that pyramid. Again, towards the top, because those are caught after the automated end-to-end test. They can only be caught by a human. But our ads service at Unity only needs a very little bit of human judgment at the top. But in short, I can't give short answers until I've given the long answer first. That's part of who I am. In short, the answer is it belongs at the top of the pyramid, and the sizes vary depending on context.
Great. Okay, so the next question, and I'm sort of bouncing around with these, knowing
totally
I know how you're going to rant on some of these, so I'm going to save those to the end. So someone, just because I've listened to A/B testing podcasts, and if you do that, then you sort of get an idea of Alan's rants. So how do you introduce the concept of unit tests into a team that has no desire to do so? The code is basically spaghetti, and even if they want to, it'll be difficult.
I've done this before, and what a great question, because I've done this before years ago. The first thing is the anecdote first, and then I'll go back. I introduced unit testing to Windows CE maybe back in 2001. I had devs that came to me and said, if we're writing these unit tests, what is the test team going to do? Facepalm. But I had one of the testers on the team come to me, not one of the better testers, I'll say, and say, if the devs are writing unit tests, what are we going to do? Which earned the double facepalm. So in that process, I got them set up with a unit test framework. We had a test framework that was close and modified it for them. I made it brain dead easy for them to write unit tests. Uh, I made sure they had a framework to work in, and again, depending on your background and experience or who's on your team, that may be difficult to do. But what made me successful is I made sure they had a framework. I made sure it was easy to use. It was integrated into their other work, so they could just use this thing and write, you know, a unit test, right? A very simple unit test, just so they can get used to the idea. I would often pair with them. I would answer their questions and be available to help them just get started. Even at the beginning, not setting any expectations, just very gradually. I'm very much the fan of the boiled frogs parable. You can look that up, but it describes gradual change. People know they're changing. After I got a chunk of the development team writing unit tests, and again, just writing a few, not very great unit tests, not high levels of coverage, I began monitoring code reviews and saying, and in some cases going, hey, let's add one more test for this, and they would. Or I'd say, why don't you write a unit test for this? The guy sitting next to you has done a whole bunch. You can help him, and spreading across the team in that way, so I could scale to getting everyone to write unit tests. And then eventually, separate from that, I began measuring code coverage on unit tests. And what I believe about code coverage, it's a wonderful tool and a horrible metric. I don't like measuring the number. You can if you want. It's interesting, and there's some uses for that. But what I like best about code coverage, it shows you what code isn't tested at all. And I would slowly get the team used to using code coverage to figure out where are some risky areas where you may want to add some additional unit tests. And just a very gradual approach to get them to do it. As far as spaghetti code goes, there's a Michael Feathers book called, I'm going to paraphrase, he's only written one book, I think, but Working with Legacy Code or Unit Testing Legacy Code, which has a bunch of great patterns and strategies and ideas for adding unit tests to a old legacy brittle spaghetti code base. That's been helpful to everyone I've recommended it to who's been in a similar situation.
Excellent. So we can go a little bit further past the 60 minutes, just because there's a bunch of questions. And so one of the questions, and I think it's a really good one, is so you've talked about how you should basically push tests below the UI. UI should have the lowest amount of tests, automated tests. Mm-hmm. And so how does someone in a testing role basically learn the skills to be able to do that? So if they're considering writing test automation, it's at the UI level, it's a well-worn path. There's a lot of references for doing that, but how would they go about gaining the skills, learning to be able to write like integration tests and unit tests? Can you speak a little to that?
Yes, and I have the answer that doesn't answer it, which is my opinion. Then I'll try and answer it. Okay. My answer is I didn't go into it in this webinar. But I believe almost all that testing, everything below end to end, should be owned by the developer writing the code. And the developers I work with write their own unit tests, integration tests, and even a fair chunk of their end-to-end tests. For my team and the testers I work with focus on just writing tests that test just those stress tests, those high-level tests, those big tests, if you use Google terms. But in the interim, while you're working with your dev team on owning more and more of that testing, I think the best technique I've used is to pair and partner. There's probably a framework at that level, or there's some way to do that. And again, I think there's the line between unit and integration is fuzzy sometimes. So I end up just using the Google model, calling them big and medium tests. And those medium tests, those medium-sized tests, they connect a bunch of different units or some different components. They're maybe not a full end-to-end test, but they're going to make sure that some things work together. They're most often going to use mocks. So we want to look up and see how those are being used or could be used for their product. But you kind of want to make sure that you want to make sure that you have a set of tests that can look across a set of components that may make up a feature and make sure all those pieces work together. Another definition I use for integration tests is a test you write to make sure your component isn't broken by anybody else or vice versa. So in that mindset, it's often an extension of the unit test framework, but it may also be an extension of some other framework. I don't think it's too contextual for me to recommend one, but in my rambling answer, I would say learn mocks, pair with the developers on making sure those tests exist. And that's the best, because they're going to know that code better and where things connect. Ideally, as I said, to unwind, they should write those tests. But in the meantime, I would pair with them. And I found massive value over the years, including up to today, on pairing that tester mindset with the developer to write a bunch of really great tests and to find a bunch of really great bugs. Because I pair with developers both on creating tests, helping them create tests, and also helping them helping us test end to end. So sort of a rambling answer, but I think I paraphrased it down to find a framework that works, make sure you know how to use mocks, and pair with developers.
Yeah, I can definitely echo the pairing with developers. That's turns out to be a big, huge knowledge transfer in both directions for that type of thing. So another question says, I'm struggling with convincing management that we need coders and that automation is full-blown coding. The pushback is that we can find manual testers who want to learn automation. Are there some successful strategies you've employed to help manage that understanding that automation really is code, you need to have clean code, that type of thing?
You can change your manager or you can change your manager, is the line that comes to mind immediately. And what we're talking about here is changing your manager's viewpoint, not getting a new manager, while both are sometimes valid. You've heard me rant, you know my opinion. I think that taking your manual testers and teaching them enough code to write UI automation is a really stupid idea. Convincing management of that, however, is, again, it's another boiled frogs approach. I always like for bad management like that, did I say bad? I just did. I'll call it an uneducated manager, data-driven approach. I would show examples both from in the company, outside of the company. It's like here we had maybe another part of the company. You can find the org. I'm sure you can find anecdotes, at least, of teams that have tried to spin up manual testers, not the best term, to write a bunch of automation and how that's been used. And anecdotally, I can tell you every time I've seen that, I've seen a whole bunch of crappy tests that end up getting thrown out. I'm not answering the question very well because I think it's a challenge when management pushes down and says, rather than write coders, we'll take our people that know what they're doing, we'll take our current set of testers and see if they can ramp up. And I guess what I would point out then is just go with the facts. I think these are pretty easily provable with data from the internet. Or I'll write it up for you. Is that writing that good UI automation that you can trust is a very difficult thing to do. And then the amount of time you'll invest in debugging test failures, whether testers are doing that or developers are doing that, will far outweigh the perceived benefit you'll get from writing that automation. And then also, if it's a UI extensive app, often it's going to take a long time if you're just writing end-to-end tests versus that looping tests we talked about that look for those more obscure bugs. It's going to take a long time before you get your return on investment from writing even those end-to-end tests versus just having people use the product and notice things. So not a great answer, but I'm happy to help you with more of that offline because I think it is a challenge that some test managers think that's a valid path.
Okay, excellent. So one of the things I just noticed that you don't have on your slide, so we're going to wrap up. You don't have on your slide, you don't have your Twitter handle, which is @AlanPage. So if people want to follow up with you offline, what's another good way to contact you?
That's probably the best, but you're welcome to just email me also at alan@angryweasel.com.
Excellent.
ALAN. And that's probably the two best ways.
All right. Someone also asked a question about since you paraphrased Michael Bolton and your opinion on the automated checks versus test automation verbiage. I'm going to just go ahead and say you should listen to the A/B testing podcast because you will hear Alan rant about that a lot. I don't know if there's a specific episode, but you should go to the A/B testing podcast because then you'll learn a lot about that.
This is like the crossover episodes in
Yeah,
comics.
that's right.
Yeah.
All right.
For the end.
So thank you very much, Alan. Let's go ahead and wrap this up. And thanks everyone for joining. Like I said, if you have any questions or anything, go ahead and ping Alan or myself. And thanks everyone for joining.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.